Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas! It's me, Santa Claus. I've come back to read Chapter 10 of A Miracle on 34th Street. We're getting very far along in this book. Let me get comfortable in my chair and we'll go ahead and we'll start with Chapter 10. Are you ready? Okay. Yesterday was a very short chapter. I don't know about today. We'll find out as we read it. How's that sound? Okay. All right. That evening, when the happy trio came home to Doris's apartment, they saw Susan playing with 3 or 4 other children. Doris was surprised because up to now, Susan had been more or less a lone wolf cub in the neighborhood, content to amuse herself in her own room. She had always complained that the other children played silly games, but here she was now, knee-deep in a game of fantasy and liking it. Of course, she was not quite as experienced as the other kids in pretending to be a witch, but she was trying, and it was obvious that under Chris's coaching her imagination was developing nicely. Doris couldn't help but be pleased as she watched Susan romp all over the furniture, trying to scare the other witches. Maybe the psychologist would not approve of a 6-year-old making believe that she was a non-existent sorceress, but at the moment Doris did because she had never seen Susan enjoying herself quite as much. At dinner, Doris seemed a different person. She was happy, relaxed, warm, the exact opposite of the stern Mrs. Walker of a few weeks ago. Chris was in the clouds. As he read a story to Susan after dinner, he glowed happily and assured the child that she would get her wish for Christmas. In the kitchen, Doris and Fred were helping Cleo with the dishes. Doris regretfully explained to Fred that she had to leave him for the evening. Mr. Sawyer, the vocational guidance expert, was giving a lecture before a study group of personnel heads. Doris was chairman of the committee. She had arranged for Sawyer to speak and was to introduce him. Much as she hated to go, she was afraid she simply had to. The meeting had been planned weeks ago. Due to the nature of the lecture, Doris thought it just as well not to mention where she was going in front of Chris. After she had gone, Fred and Chris put Susan to bed. While Fred went next door to get his pipe and tobacco, Chris's eye caught a mimeographed postcard laying on Doris's desk. He picked it up and read it. And it's like a little middle thing here. I'm going to just read it to you exactly how it is in the book. Personnel Study Group. Doris Walker, Chairman. Will meet at 8:30 p.m. Wednesday, December 18th in the Neighborhood Center Auditorium, Greenwich Village. Speaker, Mr. Albert Sawyer. Subject, Exploding the Myth of Santa Claus. An open discussion will follow the lecture. Oh no. Kris Kringle's whole being bristled as he read this. He picked up his hat and his cane and stalked out. At the neighborhood center, the usher politely refused to let Chris into the auditorium. Admission to the lecture was by invitation only, and Chris had left the card in Doris's apartment. But Mr. Kringle was determined to hear what this lunkhead Sawyer had to say. Quietly, he decided to do some exploring. There must be other ways of getting into the place. He wandered slowly down a hallway which seemed to run along the side of the auditorium. After a bit, he came to a door which was unlocked. He opened it quietly and walked up a few steps. As he did so, he heard Doris's voice saying, "And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Albert Sawyer." There followed a polite round of applause. Chris found himself backstage. Sawyer began by saying that the setting in which he found himself seemed hardly appropriate for a lecture of this sort, but he hoped the audience would bear with him. It seemed that the Children's Theater was giving its Christmas production on this stage, and the set, which contains a large window and a huge fireplace — I got a fireplace around here somewhere. Oh well. — could not be removed between performances. Sawyer was at the front of the stage, reading his speech at a lectern. The symbolic figure of Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, or Kris Kringle, he began, represents a classic expression of the wishful dreaming of all children. He is the omnipotent giver, the generous father. Mature adults who seek to perpetrate this myth reveal themselves as incomplete and neurotic personalities. They are clinging to infantile fantasies and show themselves unable to face reality. This last remark was greeted with an audible burst of laughter from the audience. Sawyer looked up, disturbed. He did not know that behind him, at the back of the stage, the figure of Kris Kringle was framed in the large cellophane window. But Doris had spotted Chris, and she was in a panic. She had no idea how he had gotten there or what he would do next. Still mystified by the laughter, Sawyer continued with his lecture. People often wish to act as Santa, he said, and they did this to compensate for strong feelings of guilt. Fathers who felt guilty toward their children showered them with gifts, and wealthy men who played Santa by vast philanthropies covered feelings of guilt about the money they had made at the expense of others. As Sawyer continued, Chris behind the scenery began to sputter and fume and shake his cane in anger. Doris anxiously tried to quiet him with grimaces and gestures, but as Sawyer's remarks grew more and more condemning, Chris's mutterings grew more and more voluble. Chris now had one idea: to get from behind the scenery onto the stage. He finally saw a small aperture in the backdrop. At that moment, Sawyer dealt a terrific body blow to the whole subject of Santa Claus. Far from doing good in the world, this vicious myth has done more. Oh, hold on, let's go ahead and do that sentence again. I kind of got it messed up on the words. Far from doing good in the world, this vicious myth has done more harm than drugs, he declared. This last was too much for Mr. Kringle. Before Doris knew what had happened, he had burst out onto the stage. His entrance could not have been more dramatic. Right in the middle of this diatribe against Santa, the living image of Santa Claus appeared out of the fireplace. Chris's entrance was too much for the audience. They rocked and screamed with laughter, but to Mr. Kringle, it wasn't funny. Chris's entrance was too much for the audience. I read that sentence already. Oh my goodness, that's 2 times. Let's go ahead and keep going. All right? Sometimes you make a mistake when you're reading and you just ignore it, keep going. That'll be fine. Sawyer was astounded to see Chris, and he was also very angry. Now look here, Chris began. I am giving this lecture, Mr. Kringle, Sawyer declared. The name of Kringle brought another laugh, which Sawyer had not expected. Doris was on her feet now, vainly pleading with Chris. There is to be open discussion, replied Kringle. I believe I have a right to be heard. I don't know anyone better qualified than myself to answer your absurd remarks. The discussion will take place after the lecture, said Mr. Sawyer. Very well, said Chris. He walked to one side of the stage, seated himself on a prop bench, and waited for Sawyer to resume. Completely flustered, poor Mr. Sawyer attempted to continue, but Chris was still the center of attention. Each time Sawyer made a remark which seemed ridiculous to Chris, his face clearly indicated his reaction. All Chris had to do was raise one eyebrow or touch his nose with his cane to bring a roar of laughter from the listeners. And then our picture says, right in the middle of this diatribe against Santa, the living image of Santa Claus appeared out of the fireplace. Isn't that funny? See? He's like, I'll get that Mr. Sawyer who doesn't believe in me and tell him what for, and he's going out of the fireplace, just like Santa Claus. Fireplaces are fun, but you shouldn't go in them. Only Santa Claus goes in the fireplace. Okay. Well, let's finish this chapter. It was at this point that Fred slipped into the back of the auditorium. Having exhausted all means of locating Chris, he had found the card on Doris's desk and rushed here to tell her. When he saw Chris peacefully seated on the platform, he gave a relieved grin and sat down to watch the proceedings. Sawyer became more and more confused as he struggled to continue. He began to stutter and to mix words up. His reference to Clantasaws, that is funny, sent the audience into stitches, and the more they laughed, the worse Sawyer grew. Finally, one sentence came out so garbled that Mr. Sawyer had to start it all over again. Oh, what? Just had that happen. Mine was garbled? All right. Chris couldn't resist the temptation. He held up 2 fingers at Mr. Sawyer. How many fingers do you see? He asked. This was too much for Mr. Sawyer. He turned white with rage. I refuse to continue, he stormed, until this old jackanapes is removed from the platform. Doris was on her feet, beseeching Chris to be reasonable. I am entirely reasonable, my dear, said Chris, but I intend to show the absurdity of all this hogwash Mr. Sawyer has been spouting, and until I do, I'll not move 1 inch. You won't, said Sawyer, advancing ominously. We'll see about that. Mr. Kringle held his ground. Jackanapes am I, he said ominously, and he toyed with his cane as Sawyer approached. Don't you threaten me with that stick, roared Sawyer. Leave this platform, do you hear? Chris raised his cane, prepared to defend himself, and Sawyer grabbed for it furiously. With a quick tug, Mr. Kringle pulled it free. As he did so, the stick grazed Mr. Sawyer's cheek. He hit me, screamed Sawyer, jumping back. I wish I had, said Chris scornfully. Doris quickly stepped between them, trying to restore order. Look here, Mrs. Walker, said Sawyer, nursing a slightly red spot on his cheek. Poor guy, right there. If you insist upon defending this dangerous maniac, I shall call the police at once. No, no, cried Doris anxiously. Sawyer at last saw his chance to do some face-saving and made an exit. Things had gotten entirely out of control. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, the lecture is terminated. He turned to Doris. Very well, I shall not call the police now. I will see you in Mr. Shellhammer's office tomorrow morning, and we shall decide on a course of action. He glared at Chris. Society has ways of protecting itself against such people, and with that he strode from the platform. Wow, how exciting was that? Did you hear all that, children? Mr. Sawyer doesn't seem like a very nice man, does he? He doesn't believe in me. How could he not believe in me? So, all right. Well, that was chapter 10. Tomorrow we'll read chapter 11. So, until tomorrow, I will see you then. You have a very, very, very Merry Christmas. Bye.